I went to the university at Buffalo fresh out of high school in the early 2000s. At that time, the online world was a bit like the Wild West, which included having to do quite a bit more digging to find specific information than today's split-second Google search. As such, it was a much easier time for colleges and universities to hide or spin campus crime statistics to make themselves look better for prospective students. Case in point, I was at orientation a month or two before my freshman year, and one of the mass presentations I had to attend was about campus safety. Bright-faced upperclassmen orientation aides enthusiastically and verbally paraded the school, boasting about how North Campus was at the time, the safest town in the country, which was in Elmhurst, New York, and that the only murder in the recent history has occurred 9 years ago to an unfortunate student named Linda Yalem, who was murdered on the campus's bike path during a lone early morning run. It was a fate that we were assured could be avoided by simply not hitting the bike path alone. What they conveniently didn't reveal was A, the killer hadn't been caught yet, and B, Yalem wasn't his only victim. He was a serial rapist and eventual serial killer who had already been active in the area at least 25 years in downtown Buffalo and on the secluded bike paths of the Buffalo suburbs. In retrospect, as this information has been readily accessible as it is now, it probably would have kept me from the most bone-chilling encounter of my life. Fast forward 3 years. I was a very depressed 20-year-old who was struggling with her sexual identity and her parents' reaction to it in a much less accepting time than now. I'd left school and, to avoid being home, shacked up with a woman who promised me the world but then rejected me in favor of her ex-girlfriend on the night I moved in. She eventually turned out to be a felon who drained vulnerable would-be love interest bank accounts, though that's a very convoluted story for another time. So clearly, I was an unhappy young adult desperate for love and a sense of belonging, sometimes to my own detriment. Despite my roommate's many unkind and hurtful gestures, I stuck with it in the naive hope that she would eventually come around and fulfill her pie-in-the-sky promises to me. On a particular July night, that hope just fell flat. I was at Roxy's Green Room, a now defunct lesbian bar and club that many wayward Buffalo lesbians, myself included, flock to at night to feel a much-needed sense of community and to hopefully land a special someone. Since the latter wasn't just happening for me, and since I didn't know what kind of person she really was, I was still stuck on my roommate. She liked to dangle emotional carrots overhead out of some sick joy that she got from making me hurt, but also hang on to hope. And after a promise to hit Roxy's alone with me and talk about us, she showed up with her ex-turned current and shut me out. I was wounded and upset enough to leave around 1 a.m., well before the 4 a.m. last call that I was still young and spry enough to stomach, and without a ride home like my usually wiser self would have secured. While my apartment on Delaware was walking distance from Roxy's, it was a good half an hour walk. Being as emotionally charged as I was, though I angrily hoofed it down the Main Street sidewalk, still managing to follow the pedestrian rule of walking against traffic, despite stupidly ignoring a rule I knew well of years from watching forensic shows. If you're a woman, never leave a bar at night alone, especially if you're walking. I got exactly halfway home when a dark green sedan started driving towards me. I thought nothing of it until the car slowed down near me as I walked. A lone middle-aged man was in the car with a skin tone that I originally associated with the guy being Italian, but in retrospect, he could have easily been Puerto Rican. He had dark hair and, most importantly, almost impossibly dark eyes that seemed to hold no light of good intentions. Now, I always used to guys being pigs. I've been catcalled by downtown construction workers when an ex-girlfriend and I shared a kiss, and I had endured all manner of woolly, unwanted, graphic, and ham-fisted advances from dudes at school. And although I never take the stance that I was asking for it, I was young and thin, so I dressed in a tight red crop top with flare leggings and black spandex pants. The getup was meant to turn women's heads, so I wasn't exactly surprised that I caught the attention of the wrong sex. I paid it little, never mind past mild irritation that a guy old enough to be my dad would look at me like that as the guy drove off and turned at the next intersection behind me. My walk resumed. I put the guy out of my mind and I continued my track. But the peace didn't last. About 2 or 3 minutes later, I see a familiar green car coming up on me again. This time, the guy's window was down a bit and he shouted, "Hey!" in a beaconing manner and gestured in a way that made me wonder if he thought I was a lady of the night. Now that incensed me. Despite my recent struggles with my identity and the resulting entropy in my life, I was always a good kid. I flashed him a quick, annoyed look to inform him that despite the mildly revealing clothing, he was barking up the wrong tree for several reasons, and then I ignored him, focusing forward. He sped off again, and turned again. At that point, it was clear that the dude was casing me like a cat burglar cases a house. It was the time before Uber or even widespread use of cell phones. With no cabs passing by, I knew I had little hope of getting one. Public transit existed, but it was both sparse and not running nearby. The stretches of Main between intersections were long, and I'd probably be spotted on them anyway since the guy was circling. Being 15 minutes away from both Roxy's and my home, there was also no way I could get around anywhere near those places before the green car came back around again. I quickly thumbed through my mental Rolodex of true crime show-inspired safety tips that should have kept me out of this situation in the first place. Tip number 1, get an open business. Inform the clerk, have him/her call the police and stay put. Then the guy would either give up or get caught. I was coming up to the convenience store on the other side of the street where I'd bought a pack of cigarettes earlier in the night, but as I got closer, the desolate blackness through the windows told me that it was closed. I looked around for something else, another bar, a gas station, anything, but the street was flanked by shuttered brick buildings and a locked-up church. Then came the headlights, and green again. Again, the guy slowed down as he approached me, but his demeanor had shifted again. He put out his palm impatiently as if he couldn't understand my lack of complicity. "Come on," the guy yelled through his now open window, his face an equal picture of aggression, intimidation, and frustration. I kept out of arm's reach on the sidewalk and once again ignored him, but this time I was properly shaken. He angrily punched the gas and was off on his familiar circuit back around to me. Now I knew I was in trouble. The guy's behavior was escalating, and I was genuinely scared that his next move would be to grab me off of the sidewalk and pull me into his car. From there, God only knew what sort of depravity I was in for. I scrambled through my memory for another safety tip, and I remembered that making myself both impossible to ignore and obviously in distress could get me much needed attention from an outside party. I ran in the middle of Main Street and started frantically waving my hands and shouting at every car that was coming my way. The first car drove by. The second car drove by. The terror in me was palpable. I knew the stories of city dwellers like Kitty Genovese who were left to their horrible fates at the hands of monsters by jaded throngs of people who heard the attacks perpetuated on them and their cries for help but did nothing out of both an assumption that someone else would step up and a reluctance to get involved. Would I be the next victim of the bystander effect, snatched away to an early end because of big city indifference? As I was beginning to lose hope, but still determined to keep trying while thinking of my next bold move, a van pulled over that had 4 black guys in it. As a white woman, I was relieved. I knew that statistically, male predators overwhelmingly tend to prey on women of their own race. In a game of numbers, this van full of guys was exponentially safer than that single stalker in the green car. I opted to take the gamble. I frantically told them about the man in the green car who kept circling around the block and following me, and I begged for a ride home. The driver asked if I had any money in exchange for the favor. I didn't. Then he asked if I had any cigarettes. I may be the only person you will ever meet who actually had her life saved by smokes. Though I'd never been a smoker before, I briefly picked up the filthy habit because NY state bars still allowed smoking, and it had a weird part of Buffalo lesbian bar culture that I emulated to fit in. Yes, I answered, urgently. I just bought a pack and you can have the whole thing if you just get me home. Admittedly, I was initially a little miffed that the driver wanted something from me in exchange for not letting me get abducted off the streets, as well as the implication that he may not have helped me if I had nothing. Still, I had the Marlboros, he had a vehicle, and the stars had aligned. Regardless of how it went down, I had help if he let me in and the details didn't matter. After a second or two of thought, which seemed like an eternity to me, the driver agreed, and one of the 2 dudes in the back opened the side door for me and got out so I can slide into the seat behind the driver. As the door to my safe carriage full of impromptu nights shut and I buckled in, I looked out my window just in time to see the green car creeping past the van and proving to my saviors that I was telling a very disturbing truth. Until my dying day, I would never forget that man's eyes. Feeling safe surrounded by a closed van full of young, tough-looking rescuers, I looked that bastard dead in the eyes. Part of me was rightfully terrified, but another part of me wanted to look right into him defiantly and tell him with my eyes, I got away from you. I win. I was repaid with the most evil, hateful look that I've ever had directed at me, let alone seen. His eyes were black like a cat's eyes get when it sees a bug in the house and its hunting instincts kicks in. But at least there's usually a hint of playful mischief in the hunting cat's eyes. The eyes I was seeing were those of a pure, unadulterated predator, and the vitriol that practically oozed from them as he glared to let me know exactly how he felt about his prey having the audacity to elude him. He drove off into the night, and so did we, in a bit less direct route to make sure that we lost them. After a blessedly quick jaunt with frequent looks behind my shoulder, I was delivered home, 1 pack of cigarettes short, but alive and in one piece. The first thing that I did when I got home in the door was to check the locks on absolutely everything. After that, the adrenaline started to wear off and the pure fear set in. I was so terrified that the man in the green sedan was searching the area where I got dropped off that I grabbed his cordless phone, then lay completely flat on the living room floor for hours to keep totally out of sight from any of my apartment windows. As I lay there, I called the Buffalo police and relayed my terrifying tale in much detail as I could give them. Being painfully aware of the prevalence of hate crimes against the LGBT community at the time, I told the cops that it was possible that the man was cruising near Roxy's to prey on vulnerable queer women who were out and about. In hindsight, I think the guy just saw who he thought was an easy mark out by herself and availed himself of the opportunity to strike. Fast forward another 4 years and I'd moved out to Chicago to live with my then girlfriend. For about half of my 4 years there, I was pretty homesick. I never lived anywhere except my home state of New York, and I went there knowing no one except my ex, who wasn't exactly an empathetic soul adding to my feelings of isolation. I'd cope by keeping up on upstate NY news so I feel a little less far away. On a chilly mid-January morning in 2007, I was at a computer looking up headlines from my home state when one from WBFO popped up that immediately snared my attention. Bike path rapist is arrested. By then, I knew the moniker too well. The internet has since aged into a beautifully organized repository of knowledge, and despite the lack of transparency from my alma mater, I became familiar with the Buffalo area mystery man and his active status throughout my time in Buffalo. Now I had a name for the specter responsible for that bit of eeriness that always was in the back of my mind when I was a student. The bike path rapist was revealed as Altamiro Sanchez, a middle-aged native of Puerto Rico who coached his son's sports team and was affectionately referred to as Uncle Al in his neighborhood. As with many other killers, his disguises were his community involvement and just being ordinary. The man was estimated to be responsible for 9 to 15 rapes around the Buffalo area since 1975 and had confessed to 3 murders: the Yalem murder in 91, a second in 92, and a third which had only occurred 3 months prior to his capture. I don't know if you ever felt your heart somehow get wedged up into your voice box and get dropped in the depths of your stomach simultaneously, but believe me when I say that it's possible, given the right catalyst. For me, that catalyst was that printed proof that the man was active while I lived in Buffalo and frequented Roxy's. More so, I knew that the serial killers rarely take breaks as lengthy as one between his 1992 and 2006 killings. He had to have at least been attempting to sate his evil impulses for those 14 years. That realization gave me a very, very bad feeling that I'd crossed paths with someone much more dangerous than I realized. The news article had no picture of Sanchez, but the sickening feeling in me prodded me to find one. It was almost as if I knew what I would see before I even looked at him. I Yahoo searched his name and I was horrified, though not surprised, to see those same black, soulless, predatory eyes that I looked into 4 times on that summer night in Buffalo in 2003. The timeline fit. My profile as a victim, if he did, in fact, mistake me for a downtown prostitute and bearing all else, I knew those eyes. I had a potentially deadly close encounter with Altamiro Sanchez, the bike path rapist, aka the bike path killer. My lack of sense put me in this orbit, and a band of angels pulled me out of it. I know who I saw. And as God is my witness, I never can be convinced otherwise. Though many of the rapes fell victims to the statutes of limitation, Altamiro Sanchez pled guilty to the 3 murders and was sentenced to 75 years to life in prison. In essence, the guy won't be exposed to the outside again unless he's in a body bag. I'm an older woman, and back when I was young, things were different. You could hitchhike from creepy guys in vans. We called them hippies. But it was also a time when serial killers roamed free. I grew up on a farm in South Carolina. No paved roads, and a lot of communication wasn't there from the outside world. My best friend and I decided to walk to the only store/post office/gas station for some candy. Highly unusual because we never had any money. As we were walking, this car came driving by really, really slow. We didn't think anything about it because the roads are not the best. We were not the most worldly kids, and no one ever told us about stranger danger. We knew everyone and talked to anyone who said hi. Well, this car passed and then we see it turn around. Didn't think much about it, but then it came up to us and stopped. I might not know what danger from a stranger was, but I had this horrible nauseous feeling when I looked in the car. Like you see an animal predator and you don't know what you should do. All I know is I had the feeling of let's run. My friend must have not gotten that feeling because she went right up to the car. The man was greasy and dirty, but we were used to seeing people like this that was working. He asked us if we wanted a ride. She said sure, but I said no, we need to walk. She looked at me so mad, like I'd ruined her day. So she said she was walking with me. I could see his hand move like he was about to open the door, and I had a feeling of dread. Everything started to move in slow motion, so I grabbed my friend's arm and pulled her back. Just then, another car was coming up from the opposite way, and he drove off. She was so mad for me hurting her arm, and I did leave a couple of bruises. A few years later, she came over and looked like she was going to pass out. She had a newspaper in her hand and she couldn't say anything. So I looked at it, and it was the same man who had tried to get us in his car. His name was Pee Wee Gaskins. I encourage you to look him up. He was a very vile and disturbing human being. Please, if you ever get the feeling that I've had in that moment, please don't be afraid to hurt someone's feelings. I was literally taught to obey every adult, but if I had with him, we wouldn't be here today. Arm yourself. It doesn't matter if it's a firearm, taser, pepper spray, or knife. People are not nice. Mental illness is out of control. Criminals outnumber us. Always be aware. Always follow your gut. Good evening, everyone. This is Yuri K, and this is the end of the video. Please leave a comment and let us know your opinions on the matter. If you happen to like this content, please check out our other videos. Make sure you like and share amongst your friends and family to help our community grow. You happen to be new to this channel? Please make sure you subscribe. It's free, and you can always change it in the future. You have some terrifying story suggestions? If so, make sure that you send it to my email, fearofthedarkstories@gmail.com, and I'll feature it in a future segment. But you guys stay safe out there, and remember to always be afraid of the dark.